Ready, Hardy?
Yes, next is the meeting of April 30th. It's the City Council and Housing Authority joint meeting. Council members Friedman?
Here.
Najarian?
Here.
Quintero?
Here.
Sinanian?
Here.
Mayor Weaver.
Here, that was for the city council.
For Housing Authority members Friedman?
Here.
Incy?
Here.
Najarian?
Here.
Brazian?
Here.
Quintero?
Here.
Weaver?
Here,
Chair Sinanian.
Here.
may we have your report?
The agenda for the April 30th, 2013 joint public meeting of the City Council and the Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, April 25th, 2013 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. What's next?
Next is Director of Community Services and Parks regarding fiscal year 2013-14 proposed annual action plan for Community Development Block Grant, CDBG Emergency Solutions Grant, ESG, and Home Investment Partnership Act Home Programs. 1A is Council Resolution adopting a negative declaration for fiscal year 2013-14 CDBG, ESG, and Home Annual Action Plan. 1B is Council Motion approving fiscal year 2013-14 CDBG, ESG, and Home Annual Action Plan, and authorizing submission of the plan to the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD.
Thank you, Mr. Ochoa.
Yes, sir. This is a time of year where we have to do the annual report to HUD that features essentially a budget of how we will propose to spend funds for CDBG, ESG, and home funds. We have gone through an exhaustive and evaluative process, and Mr. Duran will walk you through that and what our recommendations are. Yes.
Mr. Duran.
Thank you. Mayor Weaver, members of the City Council, Chairman Sinanian, members of the Glendale Housing Authority. Once again, we are at the culmination of yet another year of program planning for the HUD Community Development Block Grant, known as CDBG, the Homeless Emergency Solutions Grant program, known as ESG, and the Home program. The city has been receiving CDBG funds since the inception of the Housing and Community Development Act in 1974. And then later on in 1987, the Emergency Solutions Grant Program was added, and in 1992, we began to receive home funds for housing strategies, implement housing strategies. And as such, the city is responsible for following the HUD guidelines and developing an annual plan for the use of these funds. The most prominent program in the plan development process of the HUD funds, with a proposed allocation this year of $2,067,000, is the Community Development Block Grant Program, which includes a HUD entitlement amount of $1,852,000, which represents a 40% reduction over the last 2 years, and also includes reprogrammed funds in the amount of $215,000. The CDBG program has the greatest level of community participation and demand for service. Therefore, this report will be focused on the program planning for the fiscal year 13-14 Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG, program. In light of this, in November of 2012, Council may remember that as part of the annual planning cycle, the City Council did approve a preliminary proposed fiscal year 2013-14 CDBG funding allocation plan by funding category. Council approved program priorities and the issuance of a request for proposal for social services and capital improvement projects. As a result, funding proposals were received, proposals were evaluated, and funding recommendations have been developed and recommended by the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee for City Council's consideration, which we are asking you to do today. These funding recommendations are reflected in your report as Exhibit 1, which is a summary list of all the funding proposals that were requested, the committee's recommendation, and the difference between the current year funding and the recommended funding for 2013-14. This year, a total of 22 funding proposals were received, which is 2 less than the amount received last year. Upon receiving the proposals, staff does prepare a 1-page bullet point analysis, including particular strengths, weaknesses, and any discrepancies identified for each proposal, which is then sent to each organization to give them a chance to review and respond to the staff analysis, and the proposal analysis is then attached to the funding application packet, which is then forwarded to the CDBG Advisory Committee for their evaluation and for their study. Additional tools used by the Advisory Committee, in addition to just the funding application, in order to evaluate capacity and effectiveness of each organization, include site visits. Earlier in the year, the committee does make site visits to observe firsthand how the programs operate. The committee does receive previous year monitoring reports. The committee also receives copies of year-end and half-year performance reports by each organization, including numbers served, outcomes achieved, and the expenditure rate for each organization. The committee receives a financial analysis report, which is conducted by the city's internal auditor for each organization, and then the internal auditor makes a presentation prior to initiating the interviews for each organization. And then the committee also utilizes a proposal evaluation rating form to give a summary rating for each interview and each funding application. The advisory committee, in one full day and one half-day session, interviewed each city department and community agency requesting social service funds and capital improvement funds. The committee deliberated and developed its funding recommendations based on the parameters that were set forth by the City Council when the City Council approved the funding allocation plan by funding category. And these recommendations are now incorporated into the proposed fiscal year 13-14 CDBG annual plan. Now, generally speaking, the approach taken by the committee this year in determining how to formulate its funding recommendations was to refund all of the existing programs, as all of the existing programs were determined to already be doing an effective job and continue to provide a valuable, needed service to the community, and that the city could not afford to add any new programs. So the committee focused on existing programs, and there were 3 new funding applications that were not approved. There was one exception, and that is with the clinical group counseling program sponsored by CASP. That's the only new program that the committee decided it could fund and should fund in 13-14. So the method that the committee followed was that it would begin with the current year of funding allocations as a starting point, as the base amount for each of the current organizations, that it would not reduce funding for any current program receiving $15,000 or less, but for all programs receiving $15,000 or more, that those programs would be cut evenly at amount of $3,322, and that would get us down to a balanced program in terms of funding allocated and the amount that was available. Also, of the 22 proposals received, 5 were for capital improvement projects. One of the 5 capital improvement projects did withdraw its application, or the organization withdrew its application prior to the interview, and that was a proposal that was submitted by All for Health and Health for All. So we ended up with 4 capital improvement funding proposals. And again, generally the method or approach used by the committee was first and foremost to determine that it would be difficult to be able to fully fund any of the capital improvement requests. And therefore, the committee looked at the various components of the projects and prioritized the components of the capital improvement proposals based on the responses from the agencies during the interviews and based on staff input. The committee decided that it would work with the organizations to prioritize the different components of their capital improvement projects or the different phases of the capital improvement projects and make funding recommendations based on on prioritizing the different components rather than the entire project, all or nothing. In addition to the proposals that were received as part of the RFP process, there were 3 pre-designated projects that were approved by the City Council back in November. Those would be the Code Enforcement Program, the Southern Glendale Code Enforcement Program, which is being recommended at $396,000. It includes a Palmer Pacific Park Playground Improvement Project at $525,000, and it includes the Ascensia Project Section 108 loan repayment to HUD, which is $198,964. A public hearing was held on March 13th per HUD requirements, and representatives from 5 of the community organizations spoke. If the City Council would like a more detailed presentation, Mr. Moises Carrillo is prepared to walk you through a PowerPoint. And if the City Council would like to revise any of the funding recommendations, we do have an Excel spreadsheet where we can revise funding amounts and automatically calculate to know that we are balanced for that. We do have the Vice Chair of the Advisory Committee here to also answer any questions you might have, and we have a number of community organizations with representatives here. I don't know how many have submitted cards, but they are also represented here. Yes, sir.
1 card.
Okay, 1 card. And I think that's reflective, Mr. Mayor, if I may, that generally speaking, I think there was an appreciation, and if we could use the public hearing as an example, generally speaking, there was an appreciation by the community organizations how difficult it continues to get. As I mentioned earlier, in the last 2 years, we have sustained a 40% reduction in CDBG funds from HUD. There's nothing we can do about it. Of our funding, we can only spend 15% on social services, never more. And I think there was an appreciation by the organizations how difficult it was, and an appreciation of the approach that the committee did take this year. We didn't receive any calls in our office in terms of organizations asking more questions about the amount that was being recommended for the organization, and the fact that you've got one organization that feels compelled enough to speak, I think speaks to that. So this is the proposed plan. As I mentioned, if you would like more information, we can do the PowerPoint. If not, you can go directly to the speaker card, and I can answer questions, and we can take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duran. Any questions from council members, or should we go to the 1 card?
I have
Question, yes, President.
more of a comment than a question. I was part of the CDBG Advisory Committee at the time that this proposal was being deliberated, and I was part of the process. I talked to the city attorney yesterday whether there was any conflict. He did not believe there was one, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to recuse myself from discussions or the vote on this issue.
Okay. Mr. Quintero, you're up to speed, right?
What's that?
You're up to speed.
Yep,
Good.
ready to go. Enthusiastic about it, as you can tell.
Nice to have
If I
you back.
may, prior to
Yes.
proceeding, based on the comment that was just made, will you be recusing yourself from the chambers during the discussion?
I can do that if that's the process, if that's the protocol, sure.
It's the only item on, so
That would be the
You could
typical
leave.
protocol,
Okay.
although
Go to
it's
the
not,
back, you can
it's
pull.
not mandatory if there's already been an analysis completed that there's no conflict of interest. So it's up to you whether
But
you
no,
want...
that's just to be on the safe side. I'll recuse myself.
we'll make it a closed session if we have any. May I just ask him? I ask him one question.
Please.
Is that okay?
Is it pertaining to the item?
No, to his background. You served on the CDBG committee for how many years?
From 2009.
Okay. So you know the amount of effort that committee goes to in analyzing all of these.
It's a lot of effort, that it's a very painful process. The last few years especially, the process has been increasingly unpleasant, for lack of a better word, because the funds are dwindling, like Mr. Duran just reported, 40% cut in 2 years, and yet the need for the services that are being provided, those groups that benefit from CDBG, is more. So we have an inverse relationship between the need for services and the money available. So that's the tragedy of it, which makes the job of the CDBG committee members, advisory board members, ever more so difficult.
And the public seems to understand how our hands are tied.
Of course, the amount of money that's available is the amount of money that's available.
Okay,
And the funding comes from the HUD.
right. Well, I've always held, just a comment, always held that dependent upon the amount of work the committee did, it's folly for me to sit up here and try to manipulate numbers because you've done so much. I can't possibly get up to speed other than reading the report. But there's so much background info that you developed that goes into the recommendations.
Right, and staff, credit goes to staff because they provide all the background information, the complete application packages, and are always there to answer any questions any committee member may have about individual clients, applicants.
Okay.
That's about it.
I'm going to get on
Okay.
out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sonia. See you closed session. Okay, any other comments? I have the one card. As we listen. Sona Simsalian.
Mayor?
3 minutes.
Honorable Glendale City Mayor, council members, congratulations, wish you good luck. My name is Sona Zenzalian. On behalf of Armenian Relief Society Social Services and the clients, I asked them to not come today, you know them already. We thank you for funding us again this year. However, this year we got less, 48,678. Last year was 52,000. We're getting less and less the past years, I know. But, as you mentioned, our number of clients and services continue to increase. The demand for our services in the community is high. In 9 months, time that we passed, we already met our existing goals and positive outcomes. The need is increasing with this economy. Currently, we have one staff member who serves as both as a case manager and as an ESL teacher, performing intensive case management, completion of forms, translation, job placement, teaching ESL classes. ESL class is not only English language, but also conversational skills that help them with their daily living needs, and many more. We would appreciate if you consider increasing the grant amount to the comparable, at least to that of last year's amount. We thank you for your partnership. We will continue to work together to serve the needy in our community. Thank you very much. Please try to increase the grant amount to the last year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I have no more cards. Staff have any comments, or is there a motion?
May I have a question?
Yes.
I have a few questions on the neighborhood and facility improvement. For the graffiti removal, how many employees do we have for graffiti removal, if it's possible? You know.
I'm sorry, which project is that?
It's for the neighborhood and facility improvement. For graffiti removal.
We're not funding a graffiti removal program.
We have nobody?
Graffiti removal out of Community Development Neighborhood Services. Not out of Community Services and Parks, though. Yeah. Javier, the big guy that drives around in the truck?
Right.
That's
But that one employee is only for the South Glendale, the census tracts where it's eligible. The rest of the city is actually funded by the general fund.
Okay, thank you. Another one, do we still have, I believe there was a program, Books on Wheels or something like that, if I'm not mistaken? Books on Wheels, the tracks were coming to the schools.
The bookmobile
serving
program
kids.
is no longer
No longer.
CDBG funding, and I think that's one of the service reductions that the library had to make. Library.
I believe that one was deemed discretionary by the library a year and a half ago.
Yeah, that's all.
Mr. Najarian.
Couple questions. The Door of Hope is a plumbing retrofit. What are we doing in those 8 units, 8 out of 16 units or whatever?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Carrillo to answer that question.
Because it's 116,000.
Yes, Housing Authority members, Mayor Weaver, the funds are for the plumbing improvements at it's basically a 16-20 unit transition housing facility. We're going to be doing some first floor level rehab of the toilets, really down to the plumbing there, the main plumbing on the facility. We're doing half of the units right now, which was the amount of funding that was available only for that project. And hopefully, again, they're going to come back again and request some more funding. But it's generally plumbing improvements like toilets, faucets, sinks, and the bathtubs.
And how are they generally funded? Is the Door of Hope a private organization?
Door of Hope is a nonprofit organization based in Pasadena. They are funded by grants. They're funded by foundations for their operations. Their facility improvements are owned by the facility is owned by a private nonprofit, the Verdugo Housing Corporation, and they are a nonprofit housing developer, of course, nonprofit, and they facilitate with some funding to match Door of Hope. You'll see in the proposals, we saw in proposals that Door of Hope is receiving about 20%, 25% match from Verdugo Housing Corporation and other foundations. So they do match their funds. But again, privately, I would say 75%. Publicly, about 25% funded publicly.
So when they apply, do you look at their financials?
Yes, we do look at their financials, their sources of funding, whether it's coming from private or from public funds. We do look at their audits. We do look at if their efficiency is adequate enough to sustain itself.
So do you, when they come and make this request, do you see if they have other funds, let's say, on hand to pay for this? And if they don't, is that when the committee agrees to fund it?
Yes, those questions are asked about this from staff level and what type of funds they have and their commitment of funds. After the project is funded, we also begin to get commitment letters or accounts just so that we avoid previous issues we've had in the past with nonprofits who commit themselves way too much and we don't have verification of that. So they do provide it at the time application a list of funding sources. Then we do verify those sources after the grants are approved and make sure those sources are available for the project itself.
Now, I have one more question. On the Camp Rosie, I see that they only wanted $9,900 and you gave them more than they actually asked for.
Yeah, that was a rarity. I think they were rounding out these numbers. Obviously, we know Camp Rosie is a project of the Commission Status of Women. I think there was just some rounding and certainly the goodwill of the committee to provide funds for a program that is doing a great job in meeting the needs.
Now the commission is quite active, and they have a lot of fundraising. Did you look at their financials when you agreed to make this funding?
I believe the committee, when we saw their report, there is matching funds as well. There is a certain amount, maybe it's 20% or so, that we review when we actually do a monitoring as well. But during their application process, they list the total program budget, and some of those funds are from the fundraising of the Commission Status of Women. So So we do look at the overall picture, because we do get a total budget, and we do look at what are the existing fund sources for those projects.
So if I were to ask you what the fund balance for the Commission on Status of Women is today, would you be able to tell me that?
No, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly their fund balance per se.
Does anyone have?
Program does, well, I
Does
guess,
anyone have that info?
We can call down to finance and get it from them, sure.
If the balance was like 80,000, do you think that paying 10,000 for this out of CDBG would be an appropriate allocation of funds where other groups are barely squeaking by and the Commission has quite a nice cushion?
well, it's the determination of the committee to look at what the exact program is. I know Camp Rosie is part of the Commission Status of Women. Their budget is other activities besides Camp Rosie. We look at specifically the exact program they're requesting funds, which is Camp Rosie, and we look at their overall, funds available. Each nonprofit has certainly funds that they cover, but they're only limited to what they can do on particular projects. Part is because there are restrictions on funds. Every nonprofit has a restricted fund, and if it's United Way, they can only provide these one programs, and if it's CDBG, it's only these programs. So Camp Rosie is a little bit more, use the word challenging to ascertain what funds are available, since they get a broader source of funds from different sources. But we do look at the program itself mainly.
I mean, my only concern is they're a very active and successful commission with numerous fundraisers throughout the year, and it's my understanding they have quite a healthy budget balance. And in light of the issues that those groups that do not have that sort of luxury, I'm not sure whether that's an appropriate allocation and whether or not we should say, you're a great commission, you're doing a great job, and keep up the good work. And by the way, dip into some of those reserves and fund Camp Rosie until such time as you actually positively need the help.
Right.
That's just my thought on that. I don't know if my colleagues...
Such is
maybe
the
we should
reason
ask-
for the hearing is for the council to make those kinds of decisions as to whether or not you want to defund somebody on the list and add that funding someplace else.
Maybe we could have somebody from CDBG.
Well, to be fair, wouldn't we want to do that with all of the nonprofits? I mean, if they're sitting on $500,000 in assets and come in and ask us for 20, should we say, why don't you just use your assets? I mean, if we're going to do that with the, and I don't know that that hasn't been done, but if we're going to do that with the Commission on the Status of Women, I'd want to do the same thing with every single one of these nonprofits. I'm not going to pick out one and put a demand on them that I'm not going to put on everybody else.
Well, my first question was, do you do this, do you look at the financials for all the groups? The answer was yes. So I'm not singling out any one group, and it's just that this is a city group where the information is available to us as council members, and the city supports in their fundraising efforts, that the issue came to my attention. So if we want to put this on hold and look at all the financials...
It's about $60,000 that they have right now.
And then do they have that budgeted throughout the year, or is that money that they carry over from year to year?
I believe that is fund balance for them, but they do allocate, any number, depending on what projects they want to get done, they may dip into that amount because they're trying to emphasize a point in a given year. That's what they have in their account today.
I know they do a lot of programs that they don't come to us for CDBG. I mean, they work with the YWCA, they do other things. So, I mean, if the thought is that they're hoarding money, that's one thing, but if they have a budget and they're using it throughout the year for different programs, that's a totally different animal.
So I think the historical fund balances of that organization are important. If they have a balance today, but that balance is programmed throughout the year, ending in a net zero, that's a different story than if they're carrying over this endowment from year to year.
Can someone let us know that?
Well, that is their fund balance now. That is the amount of money that exists separate and apart from the amount of money that is budgeted on an annual basis. So they may have any number of operations that are funded, and at the end, the residual, the fund balance, is $60,000. So they have the $60,000 savings account that they can draw on. But to Ms. Weaver's point,
No,
Ms. Friedman's
she's
point,
working.
I'm thrown off because I'm sitting here instead of here. There are, all of our nonprofits, we encourage them to be as self-sustaining as possible. Fundraising is something that is heavily emphasized, and something that, as Moises had pointed out, we look at to see, can they sustain themselves even beyond what they do with CDBG. And so, the council would have to weigh, as Mr. Najarian points out, whether or not there is an absolute life or death pressing need on this money at this time, versus are you penalizing a group for going out and raising money, as Ms. Friedman is indicating. But as I said at the beginning, that's why we have this particular hearing, for the council to be able to make those kinds of choices. I think Mr. Duran's comment early on speaks volumes about the fraternity of groups that you have here before you, that they have been doing good work. They know that they're providing a level of service, and I think they're all respectful of one another's missions.
Mr. Hertog.
Yes, sir.
The okay if Mr. Oliveras comes up. He's got, maybe he can
Your
add a
meeting,
little
sir.
light.
I just want to make one last clarification, just for myself, is that we do look at the overall pictures. Those nonprofit financial statements are looked at by our internal auditors, and we look at them, the committee looks at them, and just like any budget, seems to be that nonprofits are, I'd say, but they do run in a negative. They do run right, meet those needs, and if they're right on of a surplus, then that's great for them. There's questions asked about whether or not this program can be implemented if the funds are not provided, and Camperosi would have answered no, this program without the CDBG funds will not be operated, because it will take funds from other priorities, other programs, just as any nonprofit without the CDBG funds probably wouldn't run a program like ARS's program, which is community outreach. These programs are part of their overall budget. Surpluses would be great to have for any nonprofit right now. We did have a challenging year with CDBG with the sequester, with the 5% cut and over 55% cut probably in the last 3 years. So it's been very challenging. We know that funds are very difficult to achieve, but just like any organization, we do look at indeed what there are.
I'd like to hear from Mr. Oliveras. He's on the committee.
Afternoon.
Can you shed any light?
Well, it's really simple. We don't just look at the balance sheet and look at the bottom line. We need to look at every organization provides different kinds of services to the community. And so what we look is at the money they're asking for versus how they're going to use it. And you must remember, they have to use it within the year. So if at the end of the year they have a balance, that's really not of concern to us, because what we need to make sure is that the services they're providing, they say they're going to provide, it's what they do by the end of the year. That's what Moises and the staff do throughout the year. On a side note to that, if we're going to analyze all of these organizations the way we do, and we have had this issue at the committee level, and we've talked about it for the last 3-4 years, we want to be given the opportunity to do the same thing with the city pre-designated projects. We do not get to see how that money is spent. I'm not sure that you do to the level that we look at all these projects, and it's something we've been asking for quite a while, because we want an even playing field. We're not saying don't pre-designate. We would prefer that you didn't. But somebody should review the projects also at the same level of detail that we do every other nonprofit in the city. So my point being, we do spend a lot of time and we look at every aspect of their proposals even after staff has gone through them. So we're very comfortable with the proposal that we put in front of you today.
Did you get the information? I mean, did you know they have a $60,000 fund balance?
I don't recall the amount, but I'm sure it's part of the packet at the time, which was back in February. Their information has to be current to the time of our review, which is early February.
So, I mean, and it's a great commission, and perhaps they're creating their own problem. I have a problem in allocating $10,000 to a group that has 6 times that amount in the bank, when we've got others that are on a shoestring right on the border. I mean, regardless of the merit of the program and the number of people it holds up, we're talking dollars, and the idea is to give it to the have-nots, not to the haves. The commission seems to be a have, a group that has.
I think
there are
idea,
others that have not.
I think the idea is to give it to programs that we know have an impact in a certain part of our community. It's not we don't look at it as the haves and the have-nots. We look at where the money is going to go. You as a council said children and youth were a priority. This is one of those programs. If we were going to look at the balance sheet and what balance they may have at the end of the year because they're good at fundraising, we could say the same thing about a lot of other organizations. They get very complex. ARC gets very complex with the funding sources that they get. So it is our job to look at that and see how it's used in the community. Now, if you don't like the program, then that's a different thing. That's a personal thing.
I mean, if the Caruso Foundation came in and said, I've got this great charity that does great work, would we seriously consider giving money to the Caruso Foundation? Because they do great work? It's a meritorious program? I hope we don't.
That's not what I'm saying.
Because they have a group that has.
I don't think that's a good comparison because they are providing a service to the children in the southern part of Glendale. There is a difference there. It's not whether they're good at... If Caruso comes in with a program that provides services to children,
yes,
and it does it on Southern Glendale, absolutely. If it's a good program and part of the CDBG funds can help children in that community, yes, the library, for example.
I have a problem.
But I think that the point is that if you have, regardless of who is bringing those resources, if somebody is bringing resources to you that you as the city are able to then leverage, they're going to give you $3 for every $1 you spend or $1 that you allocate, and it achieves a goal that you have stated that you wish to achieve, then within reason, of course, where that money comes from, that match may come from, as Mr. Oliveras has indicated, might not be objectionable to you. The favorite phrase is "it depends." I mean, when you look at what the circumstances are. Now, if as I said at the beginning, this hearing is for the council to make, at the end of the day, value judgments about the programs that are being submitted to you. I do think that the analysis that has been done both at a staff level in terms of looking at the sustainability of the organizations and the outcomes that these programs achieve is very well vetted. It's up to the council to determine who you want to do business with.
I think another example, for example, is the Door of Hope. It is a program that is the property is owned by a private entity. They have a very good relationship with the nonprofit. That's huge leverage. Are they haves? They are. They have a lot of other properties, but they chose to put this property into a nonprofit for the benefit of the community. And so for us, we're interested in what the impact on the community. That's the bottom line.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Any other questions? Comments? Mr. Quintero, thank
Well, let
you.
me say, well, I agree philosophically with Mr. Najarian. I just think it's going to be very, very difficult to try to ascertain what kind of balance sheet and what type of money these nonprofits have, and where do you draw the line? For instance, I'm looking at Catholic Charities. Do you look at the local entity, or do you look at the downtown entity? The same is true of the Salvation Army. Home Minutemen, I know, does a lot of fundraising. So I just think it's too difficult to use that as a criteria. It could be done, but I'm not sure we can do it in the next week or so. So I'm personally prepared to support the staff and the commission in their proposal.
Any other comment?
Well, I think there's two different questions. One is one group carrying money when they shouldn't carry money when they should be spending it? And I think if there's a question about that, we can certainly ask staff to agendize looking at the budget for the Commission on the Status of Women and having that discussion. But I think that to tell a nonprofit that if you have any resources you haven't spent, don't come to us for funding, which it sounds to me like that's what's being said. If you have any money that you're carrying from year to year, we're not open. Or making the criteria, whatever nonprofit is the least amount of money, that's who we're going to prioritize and give money to. I think we really I don't think that's right either. I think we need to look at the programs that are being provided. And if a group is great at fundraising, all the better to them. We should be funding the projects that do the most good in our community. Adding on that layer of saying, and then our second criteria is going to be whoever's been the worst at fundraising or spent the most money, they're the ones who are going to get the funding. And that's a terrible precedent to set as a way of giving resources to the community. So, I mean, I think that there's two different things. And if Mr. Najarian's concerned that the Commission on the Status of Women has been building up a bank account that they're not putting back into the community, that should be a concern, and we should look at that. But I think that's separate from funding Camp Rosie, which is a program that for $10,000 does a lot of good for girls in the least economically advantaged parts of our city. I've gone to that program. Those girls' lives are changed. I don't know that the commission would fund it or be able to otherwise. I don't know what they're planning to use the rest of that money on. I think we should ask them, but I think that that's a separate question from funding Camp Rosie, which has absolutely as much right to be funded as the other programs that are here today. So if Mr. Quintero is looking for a motion, I believe there's 1 and 2. There's the resolution. Can I take them both together or separately?
You can take them together.
Okay, I would move items 1 and 2 if there are no other comments. And by the way, I would support if we want to have the commission come back and talk about their balance and how they're going to spend that money. This is the first I've heard that they're running a balance, and I'm perfectly willing to hear what the plan is for that money if the rest of the commission is interested. I don't know if that would have to be something that we talk about at council or if that would come back to this body.
Probably, I would imagine either. In the context of CDBG, it could come back here.
Okay,
Or
so
to the
whichever
correct.
way it has to be, you've heard a request and a second to bring that back, so we should do that. And that may affect their CDBG funding for next year, I don't know. Or maybe that money could be used this year and we can move things around. We've done that in the past with CDBG funding where we've gone back and reconsidered, but I think for now we should, get the funding out where we need to get it out and move the item.
I'll
So,
second the motion.
Okay,
You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Well, motion's been made and seconded, but I'd like to say a couple of things first. I've sat here and wrestled with this for this is the 17th year, and it's absolutely no fun. I remember at least 1 or 2 years where we took every number from every organization and changed every one of them with very little input. I've always held that CDBG committee that spends countless hours out there doing this legwork, that I am incapable of making a good informed decision to change what they have done. We did have a problem a few years ago about the verification process. We've tightened that loop up. We do check the financials much better than we ever did. And I know when I think I don't know if I was the only one responsible, but the easiest way to do it when we had to take a cut is proportion it down through, so everybody took the cut. Nobody could say, well, we favored one group over another. And this time, if I counted right, we had 18 organizations that all took cuts. That's not fun to do. I don't know what HUD is thinking or where they're planning to go with the program. I wonder what it'll be like next year. I do kind of wonder, maybe staff can, not today, but sometime, what Mr. Oliveira said about the pre-designated CBG, looking at it. How many years have you been on the committee now, Mr. Oliveira? Forgot. Huh? 15. So maybe he has a good thought in wanting to look at it, at those funds. I don't see any harm in them. We've pre-designated them, but it doesn't hurt to have another set of eyes taking a look at those numbers, in my view. Other than that, like I said, I cannot find any reason to change what the committee has done. When you start changing them, then you don't need the committee. And we can sit up here and play politics and play favorites on which ones we want. That ain't the way to go, in my view. So with that, can we have a roll call?
Yes. Well, let me start with the pre-designation. There is no question in my mind that these pre-designations make the most sense because in spite of the good job that the nonprofits in this city do, the projects that we design and build, et cetera, serve the most Glendale residents, period. There is no question about that.
Absolutely.
So that's why I'm for the pre-designation all the way.
Well, yeah, I'm all for it, but I've seen too many projects that have balances not necessary, and we're in the process usually is near the end, but if they see numbers that they could talk to staff about, not to us.
Well, but understanding
staff.
that a good chunk of that is code enforcement, actual bodies
That's
out on the
separate.
field.
What I'm
That's-
saying, for
that's
instance,
different.
is let's say the parks,
And
the
then two
money that we
parks.
designated for the parks, there are going to be people from all walks of life. There are parks in the southern portion of the city. There are going to be people from all walks of life, all ages, income levels, et cetera, using those parks. So that, for me, is a chunk of money that the city's using that has the most benefits to the residents. So that's all I'm saying, that the nonprofits do a great job, and there's plenty of need, and can always use more money, but the money we designate for these public projects, I think, is money well spent.
Like code enforcement, we never have enough for that. And the repayment, can't do anything, but Palm Pacific Park Pay Grant Improvement Project, $525,000, what if it was coming in at $515 or something? We got an indication of that. When they're going through what they're going through, just maybe there's a chance to move some. I said, council doesn't need to know that. That's between staff and CDBG. So I didn't think it hurt for them to look. That's all they're doing is looking. That's what you wanted to do, right? Just look at the numbers, but all various. I didn't see harm in it. But with that, let's do a roll call.
Council members: Friedman,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Sinanian, Mayor Weaver.
All right. Thank you very much. Is there a motion to adjourn? To the council?
Adjourn for housing?
Second.
Okay. Stand adjourned for both. Thank you all for coming and at least listening to us. Sorry we couldn't help you.